Good morning. Thanks a lot for coming to our panel in such great numbers, and we're gonna kick it off immediately since we only have 40 minutes. My name is Felix Reda. I'm the Director of Developer Policy at GitHub, and we've partnered with OpenForum Europe and a number of academic partners to study what a European sovereign tech fund could look like and make the case for that to European policymakers. A few years ago, the German government started the Sovereign Tech Fund, nowadays Sovereign Tech Agency, to support the maintenance of open source basic technologies, so the open digital infrastructure that underlies our economies, our societies. And this has really become a success story that we would like to see other governments around the world pick up. So today in this panel we would like to present to you the results of a feasibility study that OpenForum Europe has conducted, and then to discuss these findings with different perspectives. We're going to hear from open source projects themselves, we're going to hear from industry to talk about what we can do to make a European sovereign tech fund a reality, and what public and private funding and support for open source software needs to look like to actually meet the needs of developers. So for that, for the presentation of the study, we're going to hear from Nick Gates from OpenForum Europe in just a second, and then we're going to lead into a panel discussion where we're very happy to have Powen Shiah from the Sovereign Tech Agency in Germany joining us. We have Peter Giese from SAP. We have Sowerby from the FreeBSD Foundation. And last but not least, Ahlberg from Ericsson. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Nick to present the results of the feasibility study.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick Gates, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with OpenForum Europe. This is a big project for us. We were really kind of beating the drum the last few years trying to make the case that the EU should invest more in open source, and specifically that it should follow the well-established precedent of the German Sovereign Tech Agency and the pioneering work they did with the German Sovereign Tech Fund. But why do a feasibility study? It seems intuitive, the concept, why don't we just scale it up? Well, we wanted to really give some nuance and really make a detailed case to policymakers for what and how they can actually invest in, and specifically to really make a case for some of the instruments that they can leverage in doing so. If you scan this QR code here, it'll take you to our website where you can download a copy of the report that we all worked very hard on. This is a study on the economic, legal, and political feasibility of the EU Sovereign Tech Fund. This is a very comprehensive document, much more comprehensive than we set out to write, in fact. But what it really does is it kind of really goes into depth on kind of the economic rationale, kind of the legal feasibility, some of the instruments that are being considered, and then also some political recommendations towards the end. We interviewed over 20 people for this study, including some people on this panel, and there's a lot of great insight in there, hopefully for you all to check out. We'll put the QR code up at the end. Here are some of our co-authors. So we worked very closely with some folks from the European University Institute. That includes Jennifer Trudell, a PhD student, Rosa Maria Taraco, master's student, and Professor Thomas Grimes, who's an expert in EU law regulation, as well as the team at Fraunhofer ISI, and that included Karsten Schwabe, Andreas Rümmler, and Knut Lind. Felix also generously contributed to the study, as GitHub helped commission it, and our director, executive director, Astor also contributed as well. So what we're really calling for is mission-driven investment in open digital infrastructure. You've all seen the XKCD comic. I don't think I need to explain it anymore, but what we really set to kind of elaborate some of the early sections of the report is kind of the economics of why public funding is essential, and why it stands in contrast to other funding models, but is also complementary. So what we're really arguing for is diversification of funding to address market and system failures, but not really, going into an in-depth critique of the open source ecosystem as it is, because a lot of what is happening is working, but just making the case that public-led investment has intrinsic value as well as extrinsic properties that'll kind of make it very useful, and we'll talk about some of those later. So this is some context that a lot of you might be familiar with, but we kind of have a series of vulnerabilities. Nothing unlocks funding like a crisis. So Heartbleed initially led to some version of open source funding in the European Commission, something called FOSSA, Free and Open Source Software Auditing. This was very low scale, we're talking single millions. Log4j, which many of you will be familiar with, so I won't go into huge depth, was one of the precipitating kind of things that led to the creation of the Sovereign Tech Agency several years ago. And they actually had their own feasibility study, which you can find online and was published in 2021. We've seen a number of things that have happened over the last year. Number one is kind of the geopolitical crisis that has happened and precipitated by kind of the tariff wars, so to speak. But there's also been a lot of headlines related to open source, and a big one was this XedUtils kind of backdoor, and that opened up a lot of conversations around how are we funding and putting eyeballs onto open source communities and what could actually happen if things went wrong. So that's kind of the context that we're emerging into. We're also at a very unique point in the European Commission. So we have a new commission in place, we have a new European Parliament, and there's a lot of scope for us to really make an argument right now, particularly in light of the multi-annual financial framework negotiations. So we're arguing for mission-driven investment in open source technology, and what we're really trying to do is target the work that's being done by the cabinet of Commissioner Hanna Bjerkhoven, who is kind of the new kind of digital chief in the European Union. There's also been a lot of movement around cybersecurity funding, for example, through the Warsaw Call Declaration. And what we've seen in the past is that actual funding for digitalization is quite low. So you'll see here that Digital Europe in the 2021 to 2027 cycle represented just 0.7% of the EU budget. And when you compare that to the average annual budget of the Sovereign Tech Fund, it's really kind of striking how big the gap is. And you see the level of that investment from the STF there on the right, but you'll also see the level of investment just if all STF submissions were funded. So these are some numbers that we kind of use to extrapolate an ideal funding level for the EU contribution to a sovereign tech fund at the European level. And then here's some of the conversations that we're trying to influence right now. So starting in July, initial proposals were made for the multi-annual financial framework. This is a 2 trillion kind of euro package. And you'll see that there's 23% there allocated for a European competitiveness fund. This is a new proposed instrument that the Commission is putting together, and we believe that there's a lot of scope for such contributions as we go towards the European Sovereign Tech Fund to come from that competitiveness fund. But that's actually been kind of only emerging as we publish the study, so things are happening in real time. So what are some of the key findings of our study? I'm going to run through these really quick. We don't want to, upset the apple cart, to defend my metaphor, but we really think that the EU-STF should preserve the core features of the German STF. We argue that it should contribute at least 350 million euros to EU, but that the core budget should be complemented by member state and, most importantly, industry contributions. So this is a real kind of pooled financing vehicle, and one that kind of accelerates or ramps up the scope and ambition of what's already happening in Germany, but doesn't fundamentally reinvent it. We've identified 5 key activities of the EU-STF in our report. There could be many more, but we talk about kind of the need for mapping and identifying OSS dependencies and projects of strategic interest, which we think is kind of a unique element of the European scale of this initiative. And then we distinguish between maintenance, security, and improvement efforts, building very slightly on what's already being funded in the German Sovereign Tech Agency. And then there's a lot of scope for investing in kind of corresponding system strengthening activities. Based on our interviews, we developed 7 criteria for a funding vehicle, and we think these are really important in terms of making it actually accessible to and serving the needs of the open source community. So those included pooled financing and coordination, low bureaucracy. Anybody who's worked on a Horizon Europe funded project will know that it's not always the most attractive thing to do all that reporting. Political independence, very importantly, there needs to be an actual way that the fund can operate with a degree of autonomy and multi-stakeholder input, really leveraging some some of the strengths and kind of the leadership that comes from the open source community. There should be flexible funding in place, e.g. a diversity of different types of funding, whether it's microgrants, emergency response, or core maintenance, while maintaining oversight. There should be a strong community focus, needless to say, a strategic alignment with EU policy goals, and very importantly, here at the end, transparency in terms of governance, funding allocations, and evaluation metrics. Ultimately, we came in on two kind of models that were very interesting. The number one is a standalone and centralized fund. So this would be a new funding body which is created by legislation. So there are standalone funds, something called the Health and Digital Executive Agency, for example, where we believe some of this funding could initially be dispersed. But there's also kind of scope to create a new kind of fund at the EU level. This is very complicated, and for that reason, it's probably not the easiest to start off now, but if there's any chance of having success, it's right now as the MFF negotiations are ongoing, and so we're making the case, and we've already gotten some positive feedback from policymakers suggesting that maybe a version of this kind of stretch goal is possible. In the meantime, though, we do believe that hybrid and shared management structure, something along the lines of a European Digital Infrastructure Consortium, is something that could be very attractive. So this would be a mechanism that actually allows the EU to pay in, but also can receive funding from member states, and can also have industry co-financing as well. So making the EU-STF into a reality, what we're doing now is doing events in Brussels, trying to raise awareness with policymakers. A lot of people in this room won't need convincing, so what we really need to do is convince the politicians. So if you know a politician, if you are connected to an organization that does advocacy or lobbying, or if you do policy work in any way, we really appreciate you kind of reaching out and supporting us as we do this work. You know, talk about the EU-STF to wherever you can, call your MEP and advocate for open source funding. All of this is really, really, really important work, and we can't emphasize how much we need your involvement. So if you want to join us, here's the things you can do. Number one, you can reach out and we can add a testimonial from your organization to our website. Right now we have a carousel that has some quotes from people that have supported this effort or contributed to it, but we want to expand that over time, and we can add your logo to our website and really show that you are interested in this effort. You can write a blog on your organization's website to share the report and raise awareness for what we're doing. We're going to be doing a bit of a campaign to lead up to our event with some of the permanent representatives and the European Commission on September 24th to show who's expressed public support for the EU-STF, and if you'd like to be added to that, please let us know. You can also write a letter of public support, and you can reach out and arrange a call with myself and Felix. We'd be very happy to chat with you. So if you want to get in touch, that's my email there, nicholas@openforum.org. Felix, we can share your email later if people want to get in touch.
Felix Reda at github.com.
There you go, very straightforward. And yeah, we just really appreciate your engagement and attention. I think we have a very full house here today, so really appreciate the turnout to support this effort, and we look forward to talking to you about it.
Thanks, Nick. Since we don't have a ton of time, I will introduce our speakers with a question, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for audience Q&A after that. But first, to know who you're talking to, I'm going to start with Powen. Since you represent the Sovereign Tech Agency, which is sort of the blueprint, the role model for what we're trying to do here, how did you solve this difficult problem of talking to policymakers about what is obvious to everybody in this room, that open source maintenance is actually something that policymakers should care about?
Thanks, Felix. And Nick, I think it's really amazing to hear about someone looking at our work so closely. And as a person who works on communications for the Sovereign Tech Agency, I've been there for a little over 2.5 years now. We really have always considered our role as being in between technical communities with policy stakeholders, with people from industry, and we're also always in conversation with all of those different actors. And for example, one thing that I probably knew but couldn't describe in the same way that Nick and the other authors have is that what makes the Sovereign Tech Agency and the work we do in the Sovereign Tech Fund really special is how sort of low administrative overhead that is. It's been really kind of amazing to work in the public sector, where I also was in startups and tech before it, but still to be in a place that was really trying to do our best to keep the burden on open source communities as low as possible. not zero, because that's not possible, and there's accountability and all those kinds of things, but we really work hard to make sure that we are engaged with all of you, that we come to conferences, that we are open to conversation. We built up a couple of different programs, so in addition to the Sovereign Tech Fund, also the Sovereign Tech Resilience Program, which is focused on cybersecurity and resilience, and also the Sovereign Tech Fellowship Program, which is another instrument that detects or identifies specific maintainers who play key roles in communities. And the point of all of this is to say we are always collaborative, we're doing with, and trying to make sure that we can put public money to good use, and to make sure that there's ways that that we're not just making life harder for people, but that we also find places where investment is critical, that we commission work using public procurement, and that we're wow, I just became the voice of God. And that we're also using our role, which is very gratifying that the room is full, like in terms of also communication, to highlight the invisible work that happens that keeps, as Felix was saying, all of our society running. So that's also, from a communication standpoint, that I struggle, but it's also a delight, this tension between trying to make sure that you all understand the work that we're commissioning, that the deliverables on contracts, that the reasons why we're investing in specific technologies make sense, but also to be able to explain that to people in other parts of society who are making decisions, who are thinking about funding, thinking about what's critical right now, that treat investing in software infrastructure we're hoping that they get to a place where it's no different than any other kind of infrastructure that undergirds society, whether it's roads or bridges, to borrow Nadia Iqbal's title of her book, or even social systems, like education is also a kind of infrastructure, or something like really invisible, like the sewage and water systems. And I'll make a plug, I have a talk later today called Open Sources of Sewer. So if you want to learn more about our perspective on that, drop by at 420.
One of the best presentation titles of this conference, I feel. So I'm going to turn to you, Peter. Since you represent SAP, one of the companies that has supported this feasibility study with a forward, I would really like to hear from you what is industry's perspective on open source maintenance? On the one hand, kind of what is industry doing to support open source projects that we all depend on, but also why it's important to have a European sovereign tech fund to complement this industry activity? Like, what is the role of the public and private sector in funding and supporting open source?
Yeah, thank you. So as you said, my name is Peter Giese. I'm heading the Open Source Program Office of SAP, and I'm also a member of the Linux Foundation Europe Advisory Board. And as a sign of our endorsement for the study, I wrote one of the two forwards. The other one is from Mercedes, another large European company you might know. SAP is a global leader in enterprise software and Europe's largest software company. And as a software company, I think we can complement what Sovereign Tech Fund Germany, hopefully in the future, the EU Sovereign Tech Fund is doing in a variety of ways, ranging from direct contributions of our developers to upstream third-party open source projects, over memberships in foundations that are building communities and providing neutral governance for software projects. SAP is also a member of the Open Innovation Network, that is a patent pool around Linux and 4,000 different packages providing patent security and IP protection for open source software in the realm of Linux. We are also publishing our own projects as open source, and this year we also initiated, together with Linux Foundation Europe, a new software foundation called Leonefos. There are several presentations at the conference, and we donated already 10 projects that SAP had initiated into this foundation to build a sovereign cloud stack for Europe. So this is kind of a spectrum that we can do. And beginning of this year, we established an own SAP FOSS fund to fund very small projects, third-party projects that just have one or two maintainers. And we wrote a tool to analyze SAP software dependencies and then find those open source projects that we are using, but that only have one or two maintainers. And now we will fund initially 30 of these projects in the next for a duration of 12 months each. And then based on the experiences, it's still like prototype. I hope we can extend next year. And just to give you one example, for instance, MK Docs, some of you might know this, is a solution for markdown documentation for projects. When we analyzed it, we found out that at SAP, nearly 1,000 of our projects are using MK Docs. And it's mainly maintained by one person, so that was, I think, our first project that we are funding. And the funding we do, and it's maybe an advantage we have compared to state or public funding, it's no strings attached. If they have a GitHub sponsoring, then we just sponsor them for 12 months. They don't have to apply, they don't have to follow any rules. Sometimes they are quite surprised that suddenly they get some funding. And that is something, I think that is something that companies can do, that public funds cannot do so easily. But from my explanation, you also see that we are mainly focusing on software projects, upstream third-party projects that we are using. But I think public funding can provide also support for projects that maybe are not so heavily used in industry, but maybe for public solutions, for health solutions, other things. That's why my feeling is that the private engagement of commercial entities plus the funding that is proposed here ideally complements each other, and then hopefully we get to a much more sustainable setup with less burnout of maintainers, and hopefully we will enable more maintainers to even make a living out of their projects in case they want to do so.
That's great, thank you. I will turn to Alice. You represent one of the projects that have received support from the German Sovereign Tech Agency, so I would really like to hear from you, first of all, what has this support enabled you to do, and what do you think are features of a public open source fund that make it useful and successful in the eyes of maintainers and projects?
Sure, hi, my name's Alice. I'm a freelance technical program manager. My relationship with the Sovereign Tech Agency has been that I've been managing a large investment from the Sovereign Tech Agency to the FreeBSD project. So FreeBSD is an operating system, it's Unix-based. It has a foundation that's a one-to-one with the project, so it's one project, one foundation. The FreeBSD Foundation has had an investment of around 700,000 euros from the Sovereign Tech Agency. So I was brought on by the foundation to help run that programme and make sure that the money was well spent and everything was sort of accounted for. I'm also active in some other open source communities, including the To-Do Group and the CASE project. So to your question, Felix, the investment that came from the Sovereign Tech Agency has really been quite unique, as far as I'm aware, for the FreeBSD Foundation, in that a lot of the funding that comes to the foundation is either donations of varying sizes that don't necessarily have strings attached, or it's specific tactical things that have come from corporations or enterprises that have a specific thing that they want to achieve. So they're either commissioning someone or hiring someone to do that work, or they're providing that work themselves. And what tends to not get direct funding is some of the more infrastructural work that's required to support the project. So what the foundation has really found from getting the investment from the Sovereign Tech Agency is that it's been very collaborative, in the sense that it's been very holistic. So the Sovereign Tech Agency has worked with us to look at the overall sustainability and needs of the project, and not really about, I don't think any of it's really been around feature work. It's nearly all been around infrastructure modernization, developer experience, security, regulatory compliance. So we've been looking at things like CI/CD, we've been looking at generating SBOMs, vulnerability management, modernization, bug backlog management, modernization, and other elements of developer experience for people consuming the product or using the product downstream. So with the STA, the scope was very collaboratively created. So the Sovereign Tech Agency was able to share with us what their mission was, and the project and the foundation was able to co-develop a scope that would cover some things that generally don't necessarily get directly funded otherwise. And because it's commission work and not just a donation, it's been very useful to be able to specify that work and then run a program to deliver the work. And that's the fact. So we started the project last August and it finishes this December. So it's nearly coming up to being a year and a half in length, and we've probably got, I would say, at least about 15 people working on it. So it's quite a long-standing and substantial piece of work that is going to take us from a certain level and being uplifted up to a higher level, but that will then still be maintainable by the same people with more or less the same amount of effort, hopefully less effort. So from that point of view, that's been very beneficial. It's a complementary source of funding to the sorts of investment that we've had from other sources. So it really kind of balances out that portfolio of what kinds of things are able to be funded and the holistic sustainability and health of the project. So from our point of view, it's been very beneficial.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's this point that what the funding is spent on, that the roadmap should be discovered and delivered together with the project is really important, and one of the biggest challenges also for designing such an instrument at EU level, to make sure that it's run closely with the community. But at the same time, of course, we also have to convince policymakers why this matters, and that brings me to Jimmy. You've done a lot of work on the Cyber Resilience Act, an important piece of legislation that is coming up that will require companies to step up their game when it comes to cybersecurity, and that of course also involves open source. So how do you see public funding for open source support the compliance and improvement of cyber security with the Cyber Resilience Act on the horizon?
Well, I would view it as Cyber Resilience Act being almost a whip, and something like this would be the carrot, right? It would all help us to sort of heighten degree of security in critical projects that may not be prioritized necessarily by others elsewhere, but they would be critical dependencies. So by doing this, first of all, transparent, so that everyone knows sort of what gets funding, what gets done. It allows everyone else to spend resources somewhere else, right? So I think that the transparency is one part of it. The fact that we then may be able to target things that otherwise may not have gotten the attention. I think that's equally important as well. So I think something like this with the cybersecurity aspect to it, I think goes hand in hand with the goals of CRA, as I understand them. And I think it would go a long way of helping to implement the CRA, or rather helping organizations implement some of the requirements in the CRA when it comes to security, when it comes to sort of reporting, when it comes to shipping products with no known exploitable vulnerabilities, which is, for me, probably going to be one of the harder things for many organizations to live up to. And if a vehicle like this could help, I think that would be a fantastic thing.
So if you represent a company that is worried about your future Cyber Resilience Act compliance, maybe consider it also an idea to add a testimonial for this proposal. I think it's something where really industry and public sector can collaborate on improving cybersecurity of products rather than just seeing regulation as the scary thing that is coming down the road. So we now have time for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question to any of the panelists. I already see a couple. And since we only have about 10 minutes, please keep your questions short, because I will have the difficult job of having to repeat them into the mic, and I have a very short memory. So we'll start here. Please, if you'd like to say who of the panelists you want to pose your question to, or if it's for everybody, and feel free to briefly introduce yourself.
So my name is Hazel, and I'm a fellow of the Liberty Foundation, which helps open source communities figure out how to stay true to their values, be sustainable, and kind of navigate that cliff from hobby projects to a community. And there's a lot of sort of missing steps in that, and a lot of survivorship bias in how communities have done it. One thing that I'm thinking about when it comes to this is I'm curious how we figure out how to help communities share knowledge between each other and take the lessons that they've learned in order to actually maximize that return from the value and the funding that they get. So one of the things, for example, is a huge amount of the open source community is reliant on building software and building testing of these infrastructure that is provided for free by communities and companies in the United States. That might not exist in a while, and they won't have anything to do with it. But then also, some open source communities have figured out how to be sustainable, some have figured out how to be explainable, but many have never actually had to look at what they provide to the community and explain their value. So how do we kind of take that data, take the measurements, take the learning, and figure out what to build in the ecosystem to give everybody the tools to help each other?
Okay, I will fail at summarizing that, but the question is about the impact of funding on sustainability of projects in the long term, what happens when the money goes away, what other than funding can we do to support projects in terms of sharing community learnings. Who of you would like to take that? I don't know, Alice, Powen maybe?
Powen, maybe you could talk about how the Sovereign Tech Agency feeds learning from the community into their investment decisions a little bit.
Oh my God, thank you. I'll do my best. So I would say what we think about, because also as the current Sovereign Tech Agency in Germany, we've been running now for almost 3 years. And I mean, we're also subject and wondering about, political headwinds, where the focus will shift in the future. And our goal with every project is to make sure that they're left better off than they were before. So at the end of a contract, at the end of a fellowship pilot or a fellowship year, that we always, we can't promise funding forever. I mean, that's not what we're there to do, but we are ready to take on more money if you're handing it out. But the idea is for us that, we improve the structures, the infrastructure, things that Alice mentioned, make developer experience easier, build up structures within an organization for example, governance or for community engagement, build those muscles within each open source project that they have built up skills and expertise so that even when the contract with us, for example, ends, that they are better off because we're not always going to be there, or there's, as we say, there's many, many projects out there that are critical that we've identified as software infrastructure that we all really need, and we can't also necessarily be funding the same projects over and over again. That's, yeah.
Any of the other panelists on this question?
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the things that I think was very beneficial about this type of funding is that it does require planning to take the money and to do something with it. So I think what that does is it creates a need for those skills that Powen just mentioned, of being able to understand where do you want to move the needle with your project? What would it take to be able to do that? And do you have a plan for being able to maintain that when the funding ends? Because what we don't want to do is just create something that creates a lot more process, a lot more overhead. Maybe we're just looking at ways to make things easier to manage, improve processes so that they can be done with the same amount of effort but give you better outcomes, and maybe also ways to bootstrap, maybe getting more people in to help with something, for example. So I think that entry gate of being able to being required to plan and think ahead is super, super helpful just in and of itself, of taking this kind of investment.
We have one question in the front row, and if there are others, please raise your hand.
Yeah, Marcel Kotzmann-Bosch. I have a question about the European part, because I'm European. Sorry for the non-European. So I think that's a good thing for open source. But is there also an idea to grow then, especially the capabilities, the maturity of communities within Europe? Because if I think about if the the stewards, the maintainers sitting outside in China or US, and then we give them money. It's good for the sustainability of the project, but I would appreciate even more that those maintainers, those stewards would be then also in Europe. Is there an idea to support that?
So the question is, what is the European dimension in this European Sovereign Tech Fund proposal? Is there a plan to specifically support European maintainers, or what is the added value for Europe in this funding? I'm turning to you, Nick, but if others want to chime in as well, also feel free.
So the European aspect is to emphasize where the funding should come from and why it should be kind of strategic or kind of relevant in terms of EU interests. But we argue that the EU's interest is in terms of global open source collaboration. And so we don't overemphasize it, but we do make the point in the study that that should not mean targeting of funding based on where a project is located or an individual's nationality, for example. So I think it's very important that this money goes into the global open source ecosystem, and it's an example of a European leadership that we hope will kind of be a rising tide that lifts all boats. Yeah, I think that's the best case I can make for it.
Any other perspectives on this, please?
In my experience, and I don't have statistics for this, open source is truly global, and in funding open source, you fund a diversity of locations and a diversity of cultures and people. I think that already is beneficial compared to perhaps more proprietary options which may be specifically located all in one place, all in one country. So I think maybe it's not targeting EU specifically, but it definitely helps with that distribution, global distribution and diversity.
And I should mention there are some legal aspects here that will need to be worked out, but that is the intention. Yeah.
I saw one hand back there. Yes, please.
From the Giese Foundation. So that's great that the STF or STA does not discriminate for the country of origin of the developers, but maybe one aspect of how such a EU-wide sovereign tech fund could help would be maybe to create a pool of developers from Europe to push you to critical infrastructure or critical open source projects, so that even if some mechanisms are put in place by other nations or people or whatever, we still have knowledge and people who can work on those critical software. Is it something that has been involved or studied in the documents?
So the question is, even though it's good that the proposal doesn't discriminate against developers from outside of the EU, whether it still includes a plan to pool, have a talent pool of European developers that could come into projects and support them on specific needs. I don't think it's something that's specifically in the study. I still think it's worthwhile to maybe look at the skilling aspect. I don't know if any of you have ideas on that.
Yeah, I was always really interested in this idea of like a volunteer corps. Like the UN had its own volunteer corps, and the idea of an open source volunteer corps, you know, kind of being deployed to work on open source issues, I think is a very valuable one. I'd consider that under like bucket 5 that we identified around like ecosystem strengthening activities. Basically, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how the fund can be designed and set up. We kind of recommend those 5 buckets as areas we think are important, but there's many aspects underneath those that could be experimented with. If they are experimented with, we would just ask that they kind of adhere to those 7 criteria, because we would hate for this project to kind of lose the institutional knowledge of the open source ecosystem and kind of the community focus. So yeah, I would love to see what the co-design of such an initiative would look like. Yeah.
We only have time for one more question, but I think most of us will be able to stick around for a few minutes outside the room if you want to talk to us bilaterally. Please.
I actually feel very privileged. I have to thank Reda, Felix for kindly sponsoring my project by the Secure Open Source Fund. I think we touched briefly on sustainability in one of the slides. To make it sustainable, open source is always thought as a technical problem, but it is also a design and marketing problem, right? To make it truly sustainable, funding has to be unconstrained, like Peter and also Alex touched upon. For example, open source projects should receive funding to have a solution showcase out there to promote the project.
open source projects could have hundreds of technical features. Doesn't matter if nobody else knows what the two key features are. And I think like I said, I feel privileged in getting funding, but I think it should grow over time to make it truly sustainable. We have to look at all the activities that will make the output sustainable.
Thank you. Yeah, this question. So first, shout out to the GitHub Secure Open Source Fund. Thank you. We're glad it was valuable. But the question is what we can do to support projects also in getting the word out there. So marketing the project, letting people know the solution exists. Is this something that could be incorporated in a fund like this? Or is it something that maybe the German Sovereign Tech Agency is also supporting projects with to basically get the word out?
I mean, I could talk about this a little bit. Thank you for the question, which is maybe not exactly what you want to hear, but the Sovereign Tech Agency and the Sovereign Tech Fund, we really focus on technologies, open source projects that are already used in many, many different places, which are often invisible. Everybody is writing software, as you all know these days. You look at different libraries, you look at components, you borrow them, you put them in. That's how open source works. It's wonderful for innovation and makes everybody much faster. So when we focus, and I'm really grateful for this mission-driven aspect, is there's no need for marketing, not in the sense that you're talking about, because those things are already used everywhere. So our concern is really with projects that are maybe never going to be sexy enough, let's say, to market because they are infrastructure. They're so far down the stack, if you want to use the stack metaphor, or they're so invisible, or they're just so taken for granted that there's probably unlikely to be a business model for them. That's also the problem with being so far, so invisible, so small sometimes. And that's what we really focus on as the areas that need maintenance, that need visibility, that need funding.
Jimmy, final words?
Just a few thoughts to what you were saying. I don't think the point of the Sovereign Tech Fund should be to pick winners among the open source projects. Rather, it's to create the winners among all the users of that. So I think that's probably an aspect to take into this is, do we have critical dependencies on this? How many are already using it? It's not about sort of creating the winners of the project in that sense, but rather how do we maximize sort of the society's gain from that?
All right.
Maybe just one remark. I think there's no one-size-fits-all funding solution, right? It depends heavily on the size of the project. You are funding projects with $500,000 for long durations, and then you need a little bit of different setup. But sometimes there are small projects. Shout out to the Renrate project. You can use it for automatic dependency management, right? And it's very important in the terms of sustainability, but it's also maintained by one or two colleagues. And for them, I think it's important to provide funding without any strings attached, because otherwise, if they get small funding from 10 people and everybody asks them to do something, then it's like a denial of service attack. But it's just one maintainer. He or she knows exactly what is required, and that's why I think we also need this funding with no strings attached for them. They know best what to do on their project.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. We could discuss this for another hour, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thanks a lot for your great interest in the study. Please download it, spread the word, add your testimonial, and thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.